It's time for my virtual Jericho with John Mair.
Michael Crick, journalistic superstar. He left Manchester Grammar School in 1976 and went to a small university in this town in 1979. I've got the dates wrong there. Since then, he's carved out a unique niche in British journalism, especially broadcast journalism. He was at Manchester Grammar School with somebody else here. I will talk about him in a minute. Who both the Manchester United supporters, so they're both wearing black ties at the moment. He was there at the beginning of Channel 4 News in 1982 with Stuart Purvis or with the dreadful woman before him.
Stuart wasn't there in 82. It was a man called Derek Mercer.
Derek Mercer, that's what he asked about.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. No.
And who'd come from the Sunday Times, yeah.
Because Jeremy Isaac thought that was a good idea. And then to Newsnight for...
19, 2 years on Panorama, then 19 on Newsnight.
Gosh, and then back to back to Channel 4 News, and you left that last year.
No, I left that in 2019.
Oh gosh. So, reporter, investigator, political editor. He's always had a unique take on the stories, from militant, which he exposed militant within the Labour Party, to Crane Kinley, a name that nobody now remembers, I bet. It is journalism about making subjects uncomfortable, which is what good journalism is. He's authored some cracking books in that time, with his former partner Margaret, who's backed and selling the books. They range from Manchester United, which he shares with Jim White, wherever Jim is, and editor wrote a book that cost £3,000 in Manchester United, correct? And Michael still waiting for his copy. You read the authorised biography of Alex Ferguson?
Unauthorised. I don't believe in authorised books, yeah.
All right. To Jeffrey Archer, he managed to expose Jeffrey Archer by a simple device of going to libraries and places where Archer claimed he had degrees and various other things. And you know what? It wasn't true in most cases. But Jeffrey Archer seems to have survived that much.
Well, yes and no. Yes.
And there's a Labour seat on the way, the Labour parliamentary seat, which Wildsley returned to.
Well, sort of, yes. You've been reading too much on Wikipedia, which isn't entirely accurate. And you've got to be careful, because if you correct Wikipedia, it sort of gets low, doesn't it? And then everybody laughs at you for correcting your...
Yes. And now, for the last 10 years, your special subject has been UKIP and Nigel Farage, who sort of specialised in UKIP, including being bashed on the head by Jeffrey Blue, who was bashed on the head.
Godfrey Blue. He bashed me on the head with a... actually, I owe a lot to Godfrey, because he bashed me on the head with a UKIP conference programme, because I'd asked him why there weren't any black faces on the cover. And it was with 3 cameras, I think 1 or 2 of them live around us. And he revived my career, because I was in the doldrums. I just started back at Channel 4 News, wasn't going very well. And it got huge coverage, everything sort of took off again after that.
And from that, this tone on Nigel Farage, which is huge and very, very good. Brilliantly researched. One reviewer said over-researched. But Billy probably believe
I think they're probably right.
£25, £12.50 back. You made UKIP and Farage your special subject, really, for the last decade. Really, what you don't know about Nigel Farage isn't worth knowing, is it?
Oh, I think, on the contrary, there's probably lots I don't know about Nigel Farage. You can't find out everything. But some of it, I'm hoping that people will feed me information and maybe make paperback edition. But there's always stuff you don't know. All the stuff you can't put in there in the first edition, but then things change and you can put it in. That's what happened with Jeffrey Archer, which went to 4 editions, and gradually more and more went into each edition. But the trouble is, the later editions, fewer people buy those, because if they've already bought the first edition, they're not going to buy edition 2, 3, and 4 as well, unless they're really devoted.
So if you have any tidbits on Nigel Farage, Michael is open to them. I thought maybe Michael would start with 5 or 10 minutes on Farage. Tell us, who is Nigel Farage?
Nigel Farage is in my view, the most important politician of this century. Now, admittedly, this century's only been going for 22 years, but I certainly think he's more important than Tony Blair or David Cameron in terms of, and I think history will see him as such. And I think he's more important when it comes to Brexit and the bringing about of Brexit than any of the other people on the Brexit side, certainly than the Prime Minister, who, after all, was a very late convert to the Brexit cause, and then he'd written 2 different versions, one in favour and one against, for the Telegraph, and at the last moment chose the against one. And Farage, the story, I mean, the great thing about Farage, a bit like Jeffrey Archer, is it's a fantastic life. He never does anything dull. There's no sort of chapter where, well, he's does nothing for 5 years and you skip over that. It's a bit like Archer. Everything he does in life, there will be a great story there. There'll be twists and turns, there'll be hidden stuff. And it's just, one caper and one scandal and one, one moment of ruthlessness against his colleagues after another. Now, Farage was converted to the Brexit cause really at the time of our entry to the ERM and the Maastricht Treaty and all of that. And he was one of the early founders. He's very involved in the early days of UKIP. But Farage managed to cotton on very early on to the fact that the Labour Party in the 97 manifesto was committed to introducing PR for the European elections. Well, what could be more reasonable than that? And Farage spotted this and managed to persuade UKIP to stop their policy of abstentionism, a bit like Sinn Féin, the parliamentary seats. UKIP had a platform of that if we're ever elected to the European Parliament, we won't take our seats. And Farage said, look, this is mad. If we're elected to the European Parliament, of course we should take our seats. We should use it as a platform. We should take all the money that's available from Europe, and we should use it to sell the Brexit, the Northern Call Brexit, and the anti-European cause. And he managed to convert UKIP on that. But then crucially, the Labour government brought in PR for the European elections in 1999, although it very nearly didn't happen because the House of Lords didn't like the method that Labour were proposing for the European elections, which involved a lot of party power, the power for the parties to decide the lists and who was in what place on the lists. The House of Lords blocked it 6 times. And Jack Straw went along to Tony Blair and said, who was the minister in charge of it all, went along to Tony Blair and said, look, I think we ought to drop this bill. We're never going to get it through. The elections are only happening in a few months' time. Let's drop it and carry on with the old first past the post system. And Blair said, no, we've got to have PR for the European Parliament. We'll invoke the Parliament Act so we can override the House of Lords. I've got Paddy Ashdown on my back. We've broken all the promises to Ashdown about how we were going to bring Liberal Democrats into government. Therefore, we have to have PR for the European elections. So they forced it through the Lords. PR came in 1999. UKIP got its first 3 members of the European Parliament, Farage and 2 others. 2004, it got 12, then 13, then 24. And it was that crucial moment, really, that led to Farage being a hugely important figure, led to the rise of UKIP. If they carried on the old first past the post system, we would never have heard of Nigel Farage, and we would never have heard of UKIP. And Farage really drove Brexit through his party. He wasn't leader until 2006. But the first thing he had to do was to seal off the BNP, because you probably don't remember this, but 15 years ago, in the late noughties, the BNP were much more popular than UKIP. They were hammering UKIP all over the country, the BNP, under their young new leader, Nick Griffin. Even in places like Henley, where there's a by-election, they beat the BNP 2-1. And it was Farage who finally thwarted the BNP in the 2009 European elections, thanks to the public outcry about MPs' expenses. And because the public were outraged at what the Labour MPs and Conservative MPs and the old Liberal Democrat MP were doing with their expenses, there was this big rush away from the traditional parties to voting for UKIP. And that was the beginning of the end of the BNP, this great irony that a party, UKIP, which had exploited its place in the European Parliament, fiddled its European expenses, frankly, right, left and centre, used all the European money it could get hold of against the rules to run anti-EU campaigns, was elected on an anti-expenses fiddles platform in 2009, as indeed it had run for the European elections on the rounds of it wasn't very part of the European gravy train and all of that. Now, the other great thing about Farage's story is it's full of ironies and contradictions. I mean, Farage didn't actually believe in a referendum as the route towards Brexit. He believed, I mean, incredibly naively, it now seems, that if we get any MPs elected to Westminster, and they can join up with Tory Eurosceptics and Labour Eurosceptics, and eventually we'll have a majority to lead Westminster to lead the European Union. Well, that was never going to happen in a million years, but he was against the idea of a referendum. He didn't think a referendum would ever work. And it was only other people in his party that pushed for that. And eventually, but he was, as UKIP leader in that period of the early teens, where the Liberal Democrats had effectively resigned as the normal party of protest in this country by joining the coalition, UKIP started picking up huge numbers of votes at a time when there was massive concern about immigration as well, particularly from Eastern Europe and through Eastern Europe from the Mediterranean and Asia and Africa and so on. And Farage's leadership during that period was brilliant and put huge pressure on the Conservatives to react and respond. And Cameron's response, of course, was the referendum promise, which eventually he had to carry out in 2016. But the other, I mean, not only did Farage help win that referendum, but he then played a huge role in making sure that Brexit happened. Because, of course, you remember all the problems that the Conservative government had under Cameron, and then mainly May, and May lost her majority and so on. And ultimately, Farage set up a second party, the Brexit Party, in 2019. And it was through doing that he forced Brexit through effectively. The Brexit Party almost didn't happen. That the founder of the Brexit Party, a woman called Catherine Blakelock, who had to be deposed as leader by Farage because she'd made all sorts of racist remarks on social media, she retained the levers of controlling the company, the accounts, the PayPal account, and things like that. She wouldn't give up these levers until the very last moment before the 2019 Euro elections. And if she hadn't given them up, the Brexit Party couldn't afford those elections. They did fight the elections. He got 29 seats, and the Conservatives were down to 3 or 1, I can't remember. Theresa May felt obliged to leave office. And that summer, the Brexit Party reigned supreme. Farage pulled off this extraordinary coup of winning 2 successive European elections with different parties. The only time in the last split in British history, really, that a third party or a fourth party or a fifth party had actually won an election in this country. And the Conservatives felt obliged to respond. They elected Boris Johnson as leader, as their answer to Nigel Farage. Boris Johnson eventually called an election, pushed through Brexit and so on. But the Farage, I would also argue, was responsible for always gave the Conservatives the roadmap that we would now refer to as the Red Wall, because the UKIP had identified in the mid-teens that actually they weren't going to get very far as the sort of colonels in golf clubs, home counties party of the early years of UKIP. They had to exploit working class disaffection in the Midlands and the North. And they identified all sorts of seats where they thought that they might be successful in this. They came second in all sorts of those seats in 2020 2015. Those seats then became the bedrock, really, of the Brexit vote in 2016. And ultimately, many of those seats were the same seats that the Conservatives picked up in 2019 and led to Boris Johnson's majority and really transformed the Conservatives into the working class party in our politics now. And at the same time that the Labour has become a more middle class party. So I would argue that Farage has transformed our politics in so many ways over the last 20 years, and yet nobody had written a book about it. I was thinking 10 years ago, somebody should write a book about this guy. And he is interesting, he's colourful, there's lots to say about him. And one guy tried and never got anywhere. And eventually I decided to give it a go. Had a huge fun in doing it. And what I love about it is all the contradictions in Farage. I mean, Farage is this sort of, revolutionary iconoclast, loves, tweaking the nose of the British establishment and giving them a kick. At the same time, he wants to join the British establishment. Nobody goes to the old boys' days of his public school, Dulwich College, more frequently than Farage does. He loves going to the East India Club and, 5 Hartford Street and all these Mayfair clubs. He's really annoyed that he's never been nominated for the House of Lords or a knighthood. He was really pissed off when he went to see Trump and came back to London, and neither Downing Street nor the Foreign Office asked him what Trump was saying. He loved being the leader of not just the UKIP group, but the wider Eurosceptic group within the European Parliament, being on the front row, hobnobbing with Juncker. He was great mates with Juncker. 5 days after the referendum, there he is hugging Juncker in the European Parliament. He's full of those kind of contradictions and many, many more. And I just had huge fun writing this book. It's a very colourful book, and he's only 58. I don't think he's got a future in politics, but he's certainly going to be on the stage as a political analyst and commentator. And that is my quick roundup of Nigel Farage. But there's so much more to discuss.
I'm going to ask 2 or 3 questions, and I have to be quite careful here. Is he the grade 1 SH1T?
A lot of the time, yeah. I mean, I love writing about people that are what I call charming monsters. So you've got Alex Ferguson, Jeffrey Archer. There are others that I haven't written about it's like Stalin and Saddam Hussein. And Farage, he's utterly ruthless within UKIP. I mean, anybody who looked like being a rival to him, a possible leader. I mean, Suzanne Evans is the best example, who would have been a good UKIP leader after Farage. He basically destroyed her on trumped-up charges. It was pure Stalinism. It was pure Putin, actually. And you can see why Farage is such an admirer, and has been for many years of Vladimir Putin, although he's kept quiet about it since the beginning. Well, at the beginning of the war, he wasn't so quiet, but he's realised it's not a popular position to hold. But you can see his admiration for Putin's ruthless style and the way in which he eliminates opponents. So he can be whatever it was, SH1T. But on the other hand, he can be a man of enormous charm. And the thing about Farage is he loves going out on the street and talking to a lot of politicians hate meeting voters, and they're not very good at it. And Farage is brilliant on the street. He loves meeting voters, and he loves arguing with them or trying to persuade them. Boris Johnson loves the adulation on the street. He loves the selfies and the autographs and all of that. But he doesn't really like talking about politics much. And Farage is a brilliant, I think, the best political communicator of our age, because he does the whole range. He's great on the platform, great in the television studio, the radio studio. He's now a broadcaster, of course. He's great on the street, and he was brilliant as a parliamentarian. Never got elected to Westminster, tried 7 times. But in the European Parliament, he worked out, you do a sound bite, you only got 90 seconds for most of your speeches. He managed to hone his speeches down to a series of sound bites. He spotted very early on YouTube and the power of YouTube, got his speeches onto YouTube, and everybody was watching them all over Europe, and they were watching them in America. And that's where Trump first spotted Farage, incidentally. So where did we get onto this? Well, this all started out about his,
How many UKIP leaders has he got rid of?
how many is it? Oh, gosh. I had 5 or 6. I mean, he got rid of all the early ones, particularly Alan Sked, the founder of UKIP, who's an academic historian. Now, Sked always says that Farage was a racist, and that Farage said something like, we don't need to, I can't remember the exact quote, we don't need to worry about the black vote, and the word beginning with N, and then another N, will never vote for us. But nobody else can remember that, Farage saying that. But Sked is absolutely adamant that in those days, certainly, and he would say so now, Farage is a racist. But Farage got rid of Sked as being too academic, but he took a while before he took the leadership himself. He was quite happy to put other people ahead of him. Recognizing, I think, that if you come to the leadership too early, you may not survive. And I think he saw what had happened with William Hague, how Hague took the Conservative leadership too early. So he preferred to pull strings behind the scenes.
But he's preached to the media loved it.
Yeah, and I'll tell you why we loved it. Because he was box office. I mean, you'd never do a boring interview with Farage. I mean, I would frequently interview Farage. He had 5 questions and there were 5 great answers, and I had a great struggle working out which one. He had appeared more times on Question Time between the year 2000 and 2020 than any other politician. And the reason was that he was bloody good at it. He got his message across. He was self-deprecating. He had good humour. He kept to the point. He was, and the other important, for a lot of that time, particularly during the noughties, when we had 3 party leaders who were very, very similar in their politics, Blair, Flake, and Cameron. Actually, if you were a television producer or a television reporter like I was, it was refreshing to have an alternative point of view. Refreshing to have somebody with asking questions about you and saying we should leave. And if you went to a by-election, as I often did, I would seek out the UKIP candidate as an alternative voice. And so that's why we gave Farage the platform. And the other reason I think television producers gave Farage a platform in those early days was because it meant that they didn't then, it made them less obliged to give Nick Griffin a platform. They could say, well, we've got the Eurosceptic voice. We don't need to have the horrible Griffin making those points. We've got Mr. Farage doing it. Now, nobody ever voiced that, but I think that was the motive. And I think that helped promote Farage as well. And he would go to if you rang up Farage and, he was 100 miles away and say, can you just give us a quick soundbite on this? He would drive the 100 miles to do the interview. He would very rarely turn you down. And it's a good maxim for anybody going into politics. Do the interview requests, because you may not get much coverage, but at least it's practice. And he became adept at it. I mean, he was...
making too legitimate about putting him in leaders' debates and things like that?
Well, they're obliged to put him in leaders' debates. Farage represented, as time went by, he represented a growing and significant body of opinion amongst the general public. Now, there are those people in broadcasting who say it's outrageous, UKIP would have never got anywhere if you hadn't given him a platform. And that just betrays a total lack of understanding of the way in which public opinion was changing and becoming much more hostile to the European Union. Look, I'm a Remainer. I would vote Remain again if there was another referendum, although I don't think it was a referendum work. But I think there was an arrogance within many people in broadcasting who felt that who didn't realise how opinion was changing, how there was a large body of opinion amongst the British public that felt disaffected, left out, that the traditional parties were not coming to their answering their needs. And what you saw in Labour communities was really interesting. I think that Farage was almost like John the Baptist to Jesus Christ, to give the analogy in a church. But in Labour areas, there were the commitment to Labour amongst working class communities was, utterly tribal. It was all about solidarity. The idea that, my father would spit in his grave if I were ever caught voting Conservative or anything like that. But by voting UKIP, it wasn't quite as bad as voting Tory in those areas. I mean, politics, UKIP maybe to the right of the Conservatives on the whole, but many people voted UKIP in 2014 who would never, in the Euros, who would never have voted Conservative. and the same in 2015 in the general election, and then again voting for the voting Brexit in the referendum. Well, wasn't the same as voting Conservative. But gradually, after you voted for UKIP once or twice and you voted for Brexit in the referendum, it then became a lot easier for those people from working class areas to finally vote Conservative. And I think that UKIP provided that bridge towards from Labour to Conservative. And I think now that those people have voted Conservative once, it's going to be very, very difficult for the Labour Party to get those people back in the red wall seats. And we saw that in the local elections last week, that Labour was doing well in the south and in the metropolitan middle class areas, much harder in the working class areas. And that, in a way, that could be a bigger transformation, a bit more historic transformation that Farage is responsible for than actually his role in Brexit.
Why did we all misread the mood? I mean, you're hearing Main Central in North Oxford.
Right.
There are some posters around. There are. There's Jericho said Brexit's a bad idea. Why did we all misread the mood so badly?
Well, because I think people in the university towns and in the universities and in the big metropolitan cities, and I'm not just talking about London, Manchester and Liverpool, and well, not so much Liverpool really. Liverpool's a different story, always is. But Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, many of those people in middle-class professional jobs didn't mix with many of the people who were feeling like this, who were feeling disaffected and willing to vote for UKIP and the Brexit Party and vote for Brexit. They were I think they were genuinely out of touch. And I think there was amongst many of my colleagues in the media, and I would also say in higher education around involved in a way, there was an arrogance. Some people felt these were just stupid people, and they don't know what they're doing and all of that. And I think that if anybody asked why did Brexit happen, I think that those people who ignored the change in public mood are as responsible for, and will remain are as responsible for Brexit as actually is some of the people campaigning for Brexit. I think there was a huge misreading of opinion, particularly, I think, amongst broadcasters. I mean, you take the programme I used to work on, Channel 4 News, you take the journalistic staff there were only 2 people who voted Brexit out of 70 people. It was probably the same in the BBC News. And in those circumstances, people with well-paid jobs in London, their home counties, that's why Brexit was a huge shock to them, because they didn't meet people who voted for Brexit. And if they had, they might have realised earlier the way things were going. And also, I think the other problem was that there weren't enough people willing to go out there and explain the benefits of our membership of the European Union. Politicians who were pro-European tended to keep their head below the parapet. They lived in fear that if they actually made big speeches saying what a jolly good thing the EU was, that they would be shot down by the Mail and the Sun.
Project didn't work.
No.
Who is Nigel Farage? I mean, do you think he knows?
Who is he? He's
a real Nigel Farage.
He's a middle class cities commodities trader who bridges that gap. He comes from a very middle class background, a political background, right-wing conservatives, from a village on the edge of London. It's like part of London that is in the countryside. There's the Big Inn Hill in Chartwell. And all these sort of historic, and right next to Darwin's house. And he, rather than go to university, he could have gone to university. He went to Dulwich College, one of the best public schools in the country, Daysteel. He went into the city. And that, I think, the city is one of these great institutions in this country that bridge working class people and upper class people. And I think that contributed to his extraordinary ability to get on with people of all classes. I think a lot of people, and I include myself, I find it uncomfortable at times, at least I have in the past, to deal with working class people or upper class people. Farage can bridge that gap. He was an appalling racist at school, terrible anti-Semite at school when he was about 14, 15. And he was very much, Enoch Powell and Keith Joseph, who both visited the school and spoke, were his heroes. But he wanted to make money. He was part of the loads of money generation. He went into the city like his dad did, dealing in metals, with hope of becoming a billionaire. And instead, he felt diversified politics. He was utterly ruthless in the way he did so, utterly hypocritical in many of the things he did. You know, I mean, for instance, in 2004, the UKIP MEPs had a policy of, they said, right, we're not going to employ our spouses in the European Parliament. And so quite a few of them sat their wives. And then within about 6 months, it was found that Mrs. Farage was on the payroll in the European Parliament.
The first Mrs. Farage.
The first Mr. Farage. No, the second Mrs. Farage. And then before long, 2 of his mistresses were on the payroll as well. So there's at least, at one point, at least there's 3 of them simultaneously. And those are the ones I know about. I mean, I have no doubt that there was the odd fling, the odd one-night stand, or maybe a bit more substantial, with other members of the UKIP staff and the wider group staff. When he had his helicopter, his plane crash in 2010, the general election, where he came within, literally, I think, about 6 inches of death, because he was hanging upside down and his head had hit the ground. I think that would have been the end of it. A plane journey that was utterly unnecessary on both day. 2 days later, he's in the John Radcliffe, and the poor old UKIP staff are trying to juggle it so that his wife and 2 of his mistresses, they all turned up. And they're trying to keep the bay so they don't all, they're all at his bedside at once. But
Very nice segue. He's a serial shagging.
yes. Normally I wouldn't go into great detail about this
Please do.
in a book, but it was relevant to the story because, A, for the reasons I've just outlined, but also there were other. I mean, the Farage and his relationships are a sort of running theme of the book, and because he's, some of his mistresses were key players and advisors within UKIP. In fact, there were times where they were only women with any power in UKIP. So it is an important part of the story, but I don't want to dwell on it too much. I mean, it is at the end, but it is really political.
So did you speak to all of them? Did you speak to Kirsten, for example?
No, I didn't speak to her. I've got to be careful here because, of course, one speaks to some people without publishing it. But so I'm not going to go down a list of yes and no's. I mean, quite a lot of people are quoted in the book, and others I spoke to are not quoted. But you know better than I do, John. You've got to protect your sources.
But I mean, he's ruthless. We're in ruthless to politics.
Yeah.
Good politician.
Yeah. I mean, he's a good politician in terms of as a campaigner, in terms of destroying his internal enemies. I mean, if he'd ever been prime minister or minister, his government would have been, even more chaotic than the current. He's not a great policies man. He's not a great organizational man. He had to leave all of that to other people. He's not a great reader of books. He basically chooses what is important. What do I need to do today? What is the message I need to get across? And he's brilliant at doing that. He was also good at spotting trends early on. He's a very good feeler, has a very good feel for public opinion, which very few people, I think, in our public life, the other 2 I'd say have got it, are Tony Blair and Rupert Murdoch, a real understanding of what will watch with the public and what won't. But he has many failures as a politician, and of course he never actually managed to get elected to the House of Commons because ultimately in constituencies there were all people that hated Farage, that liked it, and that under the first past the post system that makes life rather difficult. And what tended to happen for instance, in Buckingham in 2010 and Thanet in 2015, is that the other parties would gang up on him. There would be a sort of private agree. Okay, well, you're more likely to be Farage. We'll, be low key. You run the campaign, and certainly in Thanet, Labour basically, although it once been a Labour seat, not only 5 years before, Labour basically backpedaled, or downpedaled, wherever the phrase is, and let the Conservatives take on Farage, and of course ultimately beat it. Although, as I later reported for Channel 4 News, they only did so by hugely fiddling their expenses, which led to a court case and various people being, well, one person being convicted.
The person who convicted was actually his former accountant.
Well, Craig McKinley, the MP for South Valley, who was his it was his opponent in 2015. He and Farage had been the two young Turks in UKIP in the 90s. And they were rivals and friends, as often happens in politics. And McKinley was the accountant for, as you say, for Farage's business. And they both tried to become the lead UKIP candidate for the southeast area in 79. And Farage beat McKinley by 12 votes. And McKinley decided to go and stand in London instead, where he didn't get elected. And McKinley eventually got so fed up with Farage's dictatorial style within the party. This was even before he was leader, that he left and became a Conservative, and they ended up fighting each other in 2015. But Crick was very helpful to me. He kept a whole load of papers and 3 suitcases worth, and asked me to come down to Chatham and collect them. Trouble is, he doesn't want them back, and they are rather cluttery of the loft.
You asked questions with Britain Trump, or is Trump or Britain Trump? Is it?
Is he Britain's Trump? Well, in some ways, yeah. I mean, he's not mad like Trump. The funny thing about Farage, I mean, actually, Piers Morgan exposed this the other day. Farage was actually very skeptical about Trump early on. Early on in the 2016 presidential race, and said so publicly. And then there were feelers put out of the Trump team, and he was invited to meet Trump. He was approached by people close to Trump at the Republican convention that year. That led to him going to America and backing Trump at a meeting. And then he became a complete Trump sycophant, frankly. And but certainly publicly in his eyes, Trump can do no wrong. And Trump, loved being close. Again, it's part of this contradiction. He loved being close to people in power. He loved the trips to the White House and still, regularly goes to see Trump. And he loved the fact that he got a meeting with Trump before anybody else after the 2016 election. But I mean, you can see he's skeptical. Privately you can see the skepticism. I mean, Farage has never really gone along the line of the 2016 election, the 2020 election with Stoke. And of course, Farage also moved significantly to the right at that time, because Trump's right-hand man, Steve Bannon, and Farage were trying to put together a group called the Movement, which would involve many of the world's most unsavory leaders like Duterte and Orban and people like that, and Bolsonaro, and that all came to nothing. But there was a period when Farage did, around about between 2014 and 2018, move significantly to the right, and also that was the period when he was involved with Aaron Banks as well. But since he's moved slightly back again, I think, since then.
What happened there? Because Banks was essentially Banks.
Well, Farage was, Banks contributed, 8 million to the referendum campaign? I don't think so. But I can't prove it. And nobody else has proved it, and I don't think it's true. I mean, Banks was, had lots of meetings with the Russian ambassador and so on, and there were lots of people on the left, arch remainers who, desperately wanted to show that Russian money had funded the campaign. And of course, you've got the previous example of the Russians helping to fund Marine Le Pen's, I think it must be two elections ago, campaign. But nobody, people have looked at this, the police have looked at it, the electoral commissions looked at it, all sorts of journalists have looked at it. I don't think anybody's proved that Russian money funded the referendum campaign. Frankly, they didn't need Russian money. They've got so many other rich people to fund the campaign, not least Banks' own one. The great success of the referendum, the Brexit side in 2016, is that there were 2 campaigns. There was the official campaign, Vote Leave, led by Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, and several other cabinet ministers. And then there was then you had the Leave EU lot, which was Banks and Farage and broadly UKIP, who were much more dwelt a lot more on immigration. And it was a bit like the difference between having the official IRA and the provisional IRA. And I think that what it meant was that the people who were sort of skeptical about Brexit, but tempted to vote for Brexit, could think, oh, well, it's got respectable cabinet ministers in favour of it, I can vote for Brexit. And the people who were much more inclined all along to vote for Brexit and whose main concerns were about immigration, they were attracted by the fact that Farage was the leader of this group, Leave EU. And I think that combination got the Brexit vote across the line. After all, it was only 52 to 48. Now, I have to say, Dominic Cummings takes the totally different view, and he says that if Farage hadn't got involved, then the vote would have been, the margin would have been 6% higher. But I think most people I've spoken to about this would think that actually having two Brexit campaigns would help pull it off.
But yet they treated it like dirt on the shoe.
They did, and they were. Although there was quite a lot of contact behind the scenes, but I mean, part of that strategy of being if you want to attract people, the waveries, you don't appear on big platforms with Farage. You try and keep your distance from Farage, and so there was a dip. Although Johnson and Farage had an element, a fair bit of contact during the course of that campaign, Johnson was adamant he wasn't going to do any meetings with Farage. One or two others did. Chris Grayling did as well, but that was so it worked brilliant, and they won. I mean,
short, sharp questions, please. If you want to make a statement, there's a police station there. They'll take it from you. The vicar's in charge of the microphone. Father Chris, if you would come up to the front, this lady here, as I say, I get quite rude if people go short and sharp. Stand up, actually. Do it anyway, and we'll hear you.
Thank you. I was struck by what you said in that you don't think Nigel Farage would go back into politics.
Yeah.
Especially given his first of great leader.
Yeah.
And enjoys being close to power.
Yeah.
So my question is, why is he great with politics, especially when so much of the disabilities lies the machine will? But secondly, I can't imagine those students now in these positions.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. And he loved the limelight. I mean, it's a drug. You can see how, from time to time, he'll make statements which are more extreme than what he believes, just because he's desperate to get back on telly and back on radio. It's a bit easier for him now, because he's got this platform on GB News, but that's limited. I'll come on to that in a moment. But the reason why his political career is over, I take you back to all that stuff I was telling you at the beginning about the decision to introduce PR for the European elections, and brought in by the Labour government under pressure from the Liberal Democrats, remember. And of course, we don't have any European elections anymore. And what those European elections did is they provided, every 5 years, it was a big boost to, UKIP's vote, and everybody said, oh, God, these UKIP people, what are we going to do about them? And it just meant the UKIP went up and up and up. And there are no PR elections, apart from in Wales. Well, it struggled to, even in Wales, to get elected. And it's so much harder under first past the post. There's no, there is talk in the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, about bringing in PR. I don't think it'll happen in our lifetimes. That was the essential thing. Without PR, he would never have got elected. Now, there's talk of Farage. He says he's going to run a campaign for a referendum. Suddenly he's now converted to the referendum, of course. It's for a referendum on net zero. I can't see anybody going along with that. He is going to be limited to a role as a commentator and an analyst. And he's now got this platform on GB News, programmed 4 nights a week and on Sundays. But the trouble is nobody watches GB News. And what that has actually meant is that he appears less frequently on other television channels or radio channels because, people at the BBC say, oh, we can't have a GB News presenter. They're inclined not to have reporters and presenters from other outlets. So he will be frustrated in that manner. Nonetheless, he will put out regular videos and provocative stuff and, campaign on, difficult issues like the dinghies bringing migrants across the channel, which he really made his own during the COVID period. So his political career, I believe, is over. The one possible exception, I think, would be if he was to join the Conservative Party, because I think the grassroots would love him, of the Conservative Party, but I don't think the leadership would welcome him. So I can't see that happening. There was a time in 2004 when he was a UKIP MEP, and he actually he put out feelers to try and become the candidate in Tunbridge Wells, part of his European seat. And he was rebuffed, and there was a secret meeting held in a councillor's house with a leading Conservative MP, but he got nowhere. You know, Farage started life as a Conservative. In many ways, you know, he is essentially a Thatcherite in his politics. And as I say, although the grassroots would probably, you know, welcome him, I can't see the Westminster leadership going on with it.
Gentleman 4 rows back on the end. And if you don't mind standing up as well.
Sure. You mentioned it's a theory talk about how many surveys and vegetable tears.
Yeah.
I thought we realized this was all about was already at the time, and just a full boat. You change it right ways, and I think the other girl, us the media reporters kept up and just a mirror.
Well, I've always thought that. Actually, I started thinking along these lines, but in the coverage of America, the people in the journalistic community, broadcasters, for instance, were astonished when George W. Bush, won the 2000 election in America. And I thought, well, don't you realize that there's a whole bit of America that you never go to where people like George W.
Flyers.
The flyover states, yeah. And elections tend to produce a rather bigger shift to the right than many of us in broadcasting predict. And because I travel as a political journalist for Channel 4 News and Newsnight, I like to get out and about because it's much more interesting than being at Westminster. And I like to feel I had more of a feel for what people were saying. And certainly, 3 weeks before the referendum, I did think it was likely to go for a Brexit vote. But you know, too many people are guided by what they would like to happen in their judgment about what will happen, which is a dreadful and elementary mistake. And broadcasters and journalists just didn't get out enough and go around the country and go to places like Barrow and Hartlepool and the former mining areas and just sense the strength of feeling on the ground. I mean, I remember going to where was it, Goole or somewhere on the eve of the and I just couldn't believe how many people were saying they're going to vote Brexit the next day. And I rang up and said, look, you've got to give me some real airtime tonight. I really am concluding that it's going in the Brexit direction, but I didn't get given much airtime to make those points. So we lived it, and it's not just the journalistic community, the academic community as well. They really do live in a world that is increasingly cut off, and it is leading to all sorts of areas, in my view. You've got to have an understanding of how the whole country feels.
Professor Gary Rowling is about 8 rows back. Professor of Politics at Brooks.
Well, yeah. But I just put to the ask you. So,
Yeah.
you said earlier he's probably the lowest of all politicians, 21st century. I mean, what you said about him, see, engaging to find out, and he obviously acted some kind of barometer or appeal. But some would say that to be politician, actually got iron getting there and digital policy. And what are some political ideas? And I just wonder what he's contributed in that regard. I mean, you take the other school later and absorb fracture. In particular, some of the ideas economics, well, as if Farage is economic target.
Yeah.
And he is kind of, as he knew what it is, he kind of got that particularly old situation. I just wonder, and has he said the idea building policies, I just wonder, has he got a sense of what's happening in the politics?
I think he's, to the latter part of your question, I'd say yes, because he spends a lot of his time in the metropolitan areas.
Does he take any?
Well, as I say, I think he has yes, he does. I mean, when Farage used to do his radio program on LBC, he would encourage his producers to find, he was fed up with Brexit listeners ringing in and saying, oh, I think, well, marvellous, Nigel, you're the best thing that's ever happened to this country. He actually wanted to engage with his opponents. He understands who his opponents are and the strength of feeling amongst his opponents. What I would say, no, he's not a great policies man. Although actually he knows, he's much better informed than you might think. I mean, when he was doing the radio and doing the telly, and he was having to deal with a whole range of issues, he would actually have a grasp of them, which I was used to find was surprisingly wide. But he wasn't a great policies man when he was leading UKIP. He would lead, he never read the manifestos. He'd leave it to other people to write the manifesto and to draw up the policy platforms. But I don't think you can be a hugely important politician without being full of policies and having ideas. You can have just, I mean, in his case, he had one policy, which was to leave the European Union. And he played a major role in doing that. And incidentally, at the end, as I explained, he led to this transformation we've seen in our electoral politics in this country, where much of the North has become a working class, it is a working class Conservative Party, and the South is increasingly a middle class Labour Party. And that doesn't look like changing, reversing back for quite a while. The local elections have really reinforced that picture. And Farage played a key role in that, in turning his own party from being this middle class party of colonels and Bognor Regis and the South Coast to actually being, to soaking up that disaffection that was increasingly felt in the North, by people who felt that people like Blair and Cameron didn't really care for them.
Go 5 rows back on this side. So in vote Farage, you get Boris. Is that what you say?
Well, that's what happened, isn't it? Mm-hmm.
So, whilst we're waiting, how long has Boris got?
I said 8 years when he came to office, and earlier this year, I thought it was going to be a matter of 8 weeks. But I'm increasingly coming back to the idea of 8 years. The primary reason being, there is no obvious alternative. I mean, frequently, every prime minister has a period where people are saying, oh, they can't last much longer. And often there is an obvious person in the wings, like Michael Heseltine or Gordon Brown or Boris Johnson. At the moment, there is no obvious alternative in the wings that the Conservative Party can coalesce around as an alternative to Boris Johnson. So if you put a gun to my head and said, how long has he got? I'd say until, the middle of the next parliament.
The gentleman there, Father Chris, with his hand up. Do you mind standing up and waiting for the mic, please?
It's really good, very well. The interest of time to do research. Did you spend a lot of time to do it?
Not at all. This is an independent book. All my political biographies have been, and indeed my football biography on Alex Ferguson, they've all been independent. So what I call, some people would say unauthorized, but I hate that term because, in my view, biographies should not be authorized or unauthorized. It's independent book. And when I do them, I say, right, I'm not going to interview the subject, but I'll try and interview everybody I can find who will talk to me, close to them, who knows them, has had dealings with them, had fights with them, whatever. And, I got to speak to a lot of those people. And it worked. But if you interview the subject, you end up being too obliged to them, too indebted to them, and what do you do when they start telling you lies and all of that? So I prefer to keep a certain distance from the subject and hope that they don't put obstacles in your way. Now, what generally happens, but what happened with Farage was he was happy for his friends and colleagues to talk to me on the whole, but quite a few of them were cagey, and then there were lots of others who weren't cagey at all. Some of whom were willing to go on the record and others weren't. And that's the way I operate. The only exception I've done to that in terms of biographies, I wrote a book about the Oxford psephologist Sir David Butler, who's still alive at the age of 97, lives up the road. And I did, work with him because I was invited to do it by Nuffield College. But that's a bit different because he wasn't a controversial character.
One of your secrets, Michael, is at the back, of course, the Margaret, who is very interviewing people, libraries, local newspapers.
Well, I mean, you have done what I should have done, which is to thank her. But in this meeting, and others also, helped with the researchers as well. And a lot of the interviews were done by people like Margaret.
The book is on sale at the back at half price, by the way.
Yeah.
One more question, then. Paul, I'll keep it short, sweet. You can stand up, Paul. You don't get to your position. You don't need to. No microphone. This is Paul Cloud.
Oh, yeah.
No, I have to say the code. I didn't know this. Do you think that all in all, the TV that has style I'm not dissecting in our feature straight the one has to go. Can I see that we made him know the companies without it appeared? And can I am about the idea of all outside of the ceremony, but if we go up and walk out of all these figures through history, comprehensive heroes. You haven't really said about the others already in some of the students. Do you think that somehow that was revealed?
Well, I actually did. I did the Dulwich College story myself for Channel 4 News in 2014, and it got a fair bit of coverage at the time. And the following day, Farage described me to my face on camera as despicable. He was, he said when he was at Dulwich, it would be about 14, 15, he would say, he would sidle up to a Jewish boy and say, you lot should be gassed and things like that. But, should we hold that against Farage, the adult? People do all sorts of do all sorts of terrible things when they're teenagers. I don't know, but I just think it should have been in there. In terms of the ruthlessness of the man and some of this got covered in the media. And there's a limit to how much you can do. I mean, we should have done more digging into UKIP and the goings on. The difficulty of it is that you've got so many fanatical types within UKIP who will give you all sorts. I would get people constantly ringing me up when I was on Channel 4's News from UKIP with stories, documents, and so much of it would crumble. It wouldn't hold together. You couldn't get corroboration. And as a result, there were very few documentary type programs about the goings on within UKIP. There was no real television profile of Farage at any point. And it's partly because it's so difficult, actually very, very difficult to get your hands onto the material and the proof of what we want to say. And which is why I think partly no book was ever written either. And the UKIP is full of blogs. Blogs with 10,000 entries in. And I had to wade through all of this to write the book and get researchers to go through it and point out the ones that were more interesting. And you're constantly worried, are we missing one? And how much can we believe all of this? And it was quite a difficult book to write, particularly when much of it was going on during the COVID period and you couldn't meet that many people face to face.
Very last question. Jim White of the Daily Telegraph. Jim, you stand up, Jim. I don't know whether Vic is wrong with the microphone.
Didn't the scale of his ego start pissed off, or was he? Didn't.
I don't know what he thinks about the book at all. I've had no communication from him. He did threaten me with a legal action over something or other at one point while I was doing the book. And none of the people close to him have said what he thinks of it. He doesn't read books that much. In fact, hardly at all. So maybe he hasn't read mine. Maybe he's just, relying on his aid for a summary. No doubt I will bump into him before long and he'll tell me, I'll ask him. But I remain ignorant on that front for the time being.
So, Dr. Muscatch, the gentleman there, Father Chris is anywhere around. Do you want to stand up, please, as well?
Commented on his presentation as you can seemed like you collapsed.
Well, he resigned a number of times. I think he resigned 4 times in And I don't difficult to remember the sequence now. He first resigned for 3 days after the 2015 referendum. That's right, the 2015 general election. And it was almost like one of those scenes in a cartoon when, where the people run over a cliff, then it takes them several seconds to realize they're in midair and then they drop. Because he resigned half an hour after losing the election in South Thanet, because he'd promised to resign if he lost South Thanet, which only made other parties more intent on ensuring that he did lose, without realizing that, only a few minutes before he lost South Thanet, David Cameron had achieved a majority, the Conservatives had achieved a majority in the House of Commons, which then obliged them to have the referendum. So he stupidly resigned at just the wrong moment there. And then he made a comeback, and then there were subsequent resignations. But what had happened was that because he'd been utterly ruthless in eliminating any, also he put no thought into his successor. He'd been utterly ruthless in eliminating potential successors. Like Stalin with his generals, the party was bereft of talent, and they had this whole series of leaders who were, ever more useless than the one that had gone before. Several of whom had, fabricated CVs and so on. And Diane James, who resigned after 15 days because she never really wanted to do the job. And it became more and more of a farce. And whereas a decent leader would have ensured the succession and ensured that UKIP carried on as a strong. It was difficult after the referendum because there was, you could argue there was no longer a reason to vote for UKIP. But the very fact that he had then to found a new party shows just what a disaster, basket case UKIP had become.
2 new parties.
Yeah, two new parties.
Brexit and the Reform.
Well, Reform UK is just the same thing with a different name. It's essentially the same.
One party after another.
One party after another. I was very proud of that title when I came up with it, because it means 3 things. Obviously it means UKIP after going out the Conservative Party, and it refers to and it refers to his leadership, the successful leadership of one party followed by successful leadership of another, and of course it refers to his lifestyle. But then of course Boris Johnson and Downing Street parties and so on, and maybe it's a more appropriate title for someone else.
The book is on sale at the back for half price. I can ask one more question.
Yeah.
Your journalistic career, ups and downs, highlights and lowlights.
Oh, I leave that to other people to judge. I mean, most of it's been, pretty dull, daily trudge. I've had a great life, and I'm still carrying on. I mean, I'm still doing, more books, more broadcasting. I've no plans to retire. I will retire when my brain goes or my body goes or both. But that, I hope, is many years.
What's the current book?
Well, I don't know. I'm trying to work out what it should be. But if anybody's got any ideas, please let me know. No, I'm thinking of writing a book called The Modernizers, which would be the story of Blair, Cameron, and Crick, who were all really started life as Conservatives. Public school boys, young, attractive, good on telly, all adopted as leaders by their parties. Really old sufferers, because they were desperate to get back to power in all cases. Their parties didn't really like them. All electorally successful for a while. But they all, like Farage, failed to secure the succession. They failed to ensure that, Labour carried on as a Blairite party, that the Conservatives carried on as a Cameroon party, and less true with the Liberal Democrats. But they, and of course, this all then contributed to the Brexit story. But whether it works as a sort of what you might call a trial defeat, I don't know. But that's what I'm mulling over at the moment.
What will it say in your epitaph if and when you die?
I'll leave that up to people like you.
General Retro. All right. Thank you very much indeed, please.